we have a great guest. His name is Stuart Moore. You probably know him from DC and Marvel Comics. He's written a lot with Vertigo. He wrote the novelization of Marvel's Civil War, based, of course, on that 100-issue comic book series. He's also currently writing Egos. I believe it's for Vertigo. Maybe it's for Image. He's also writing The Zodiac Legacy with Stan Lee and Disney. And, of course, he's done a lot of the comic and novel work. And so we're just going to jump straight into this interview. So welcome to the show, Stuart Moore.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Many people know you from the comic book world. You've worked with many different comic publishers as an editor and a writer. So I guess we're going to start with, why don't you just introduce what got you into the world of writing, editing, and comics in general?
Well, I, like probably almost everyone listening to this, I always read comics. I was always into them. And I started out in book publishing. I was an editor at St. Martin's Press. And I was fortunate to come on to make the move over to DC Comics on staff, and become part of the editorial group that shortly after that became Vertigo. So I helped start up that imprint, and that was a very exciting time. There was a lot of stuff going on, and I made a lot of good friendships then too, that people I'm still in touch with and still talk to. I did that for about 9 years, and then I had a short stint at Marvel, at Marvel Knights actually, right when Joe Quesada became editor-in-chief, and then by that time I was already doing more of my own writing. And I decided to make the leap and do that full time, and I've been doing that for a while now, and it's been going pretty well. I've had stints at DC on longish run on Firestorm. I did Namor for a while at Marvel, and currently I work on a lot of different projects, but I have a book from Image called Egos, which is coming out now, and I'm working with Disney on a series of middle reader novels called The Zodiac Legacy, co-written and created by Stan Lee. And also, I have 2 issues of one of the Convergence miniseries, Legion of Superheroes, coming out from DC soon. And I also oversee Marvel's prose novel program on a freelance basis. I wrote the first book in that series, the adaptation of Civil War, and I edit most of the rest of them on a freelance basis. So I try to keep busy. I've done a lot of different things, and probably what makes me a little bit unique in this industry is that I have kind of a foot in the comics world and also a foot in the book publishing industry. And in recent years, I've found myself working a lot on prose versions of superheroes as opposed to comics versions. That's just something I've sort of gravitated toward.
Awesome. So just to backtrack just a little bit, you mentioned how you've been always reading comics, and that helped you get in there. Was there a specific comic or a specific writer or artist or whatever that drew you into it, that said you want to work on comics, or was it just comics in general? You just loved them and loved that style or universe? I
can certainly there were people who were specific inspirations. Most people are either, when they were kids, were either DC kids or Marvel kids. And my story is a little different because when I was younger, I read almost exclusively DC books. I was just really into the characters, particularly I think Batman and the Legion of Superheroes, which I'm writing now, which is kind of cool. But when I was about 16, a friend of mine who I'm still in touch with sat me down and gave me huge stacks of all the Marvel comics at the time. And this was before there were a lot of trade paperbacks out. So these were just like loose piles of floppy issues. And those completely blew my mind. They just like turned my whole idea of what comics were inside out. And that was when I really got into the work of people like Steve Gerber and Howard Chaykin were around at the time. Steve Englehart was still doing stuff. And there was just a lot of really ambitious, interesting stuff happening then. So as far as comics creators who are my inspiration, Chaykin's definitely a big one. Steve Gerber, and once Alan Moore came on the scene, he just kind of blew everybody away. There was just so much great stuff coming out in the early 80s that was inspiring at that point. There are a lot of others too, but that's kind of where it started for me.
Alan Moore is definitely the one of the big ones.
He can do it all, He there are people who are as, I would say, there are people who are as good at horror as he is. There are people who are as good at just sort of wordplay as he is, but he does all of it, and he does it beautifully.
Yeah, he made Swamp Thing work.
Yes.
He made he gave us Watchmen. V for Vendetta, as I recall. He can do the political, he can do the horror, he can do almost anything, and that's a pretty darn good inspiration right there.
Yeah.
So you started with editing and publishing, and then you ended up writing all these comics and so on. Let's talk about the one that you mentioned. One of the last ones you mentioned. You mentioned Ego, which is you've been working on it for a while, and now it's finally coming out. When did this idea first start? And why don't you tell us a little bit about what this story is?
Okay, the book is called Egos, and it's actually short for Earth Galactic Operatives. But the the name Egos is not an accident. It's basically about a far future team of superheroes who split up years ago, and as the series opens, the leader has decided to reunite the team in the face of a giant galactic threat. But he's really doing it for personal reasons, and it's really part of a fairly complicated dance going on between him and his wife. They're not exactly estranged, but they have a lot of problems together, and that kind of complicated and hopefully complicated and nasty character interaction is what drives the story. We did 4 issues last year, which are collected in a trade paperback called Ego's Convergence. I keep saying Convergence is something else I'm working on. Ego's Quintessence, excuse me. And we just resumed. Issue 5 is out now. That's the beginning of a 5-part story called Crunched, and issue 6 will be out March 2nd. And my collaborator on that is a newish artist named Gus Storms, who is just phenomenal. He's great at environments. He's an incredible storyteller, and he's just a wild thinker. Anytime I throw a science fiction concept in there, he'll take it 4 times further. He's just great to work with. So now I've forgotten the question you asked me. Did you just ask me to describe Egos?
Well, share us a little bit about it. And when did this idea first start for you, and how long has this actually been in your head? Since I know a lot of people, when they work on their personal projects, they tend to be stewing around for quite a while till they get to the point where they think they can actually do it justice to the way they want to see it done, and then they get it done.
Yeah, interestingly, I've had a lot of projects like that, and I've had a lot of projects that kind of get stalled one way or another. When you're a writer, if you're talking about comics projects, you have to really wait until you have an artist. You have an artist ready to go who can devote time to it. It takes a lot longer to draw comics than it does to write comics, so you're always kind of at the mercy of the artist's schedule to a certain extent. I started working on Egos. I came up with the idea, I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5. And where that came from was I had been working on I've been working on a lot of company-owned projects. I've been working on some stuff of my own. Some of it had come out. Some of it had just languished. And I just decided to sit down and create something new that incorporated all the things I was interested in writing, which in this case was big, colorful, far future superheroes and, for want of a better description, HBO/FX style characterization. That was what I really wanted to put together. I also wanted to see, because it was going to be an indie comic, I wanted to see how much I could fit into each issue without it seeming crowded. That was a real goal. So I sat down and I outlined the first 3 issues and I wrote the first one. And then I started looking around for artists. And at the time, my business partner, Marie Javins, who's now an editor at DC, was teaching coloring at the School of Visual Arts, and she said to me, "You've got to see this guy's work." Gus Storms and Heidi McDonald had done a write-up of him around the same time on The Beat. And we got together, we hit it off. So we just did the first issue. I funded it. We did the completed first issue, and then we took it to Image Comics. Brian Vaughn actually was kind enough to make the introduction, which I owe him a debt of gratitude for. And Eric Stevenson really liked it, and it just went from there. So now we're in the second run of it, and reviews have been good. Sales are okay. They could always be better. But
well, in the comic book world, all sales are okay nowadays.
Exactly. But overall, it's been probably the most creatively fulfilling project of my life. I'm really happy with it.
So being someone that writes prose and writes comics, I've always wondered, is it difficult to switch back and forth? Because I've, tried writing prose, and I've actually been in film school so I can write, scripts and stuff.
Right.
But is it hard switching from the comics, which is a visual medium where you have to know how to tell a story with the words and descriptions without, covering the page with too much text, unless you're Alan Moore. Then, of course, you can do that with some of your comics. Um, is it hard to switch back and forth, or do you just find it natural? You have a natural talent to be able to switch back and forth between prose and comic writing.
I never think of it in terms of switching back and forth. I don't find that difficult. What I do find is that comics writing at this point is easier for me, and it's partly because I've done more of it, but it's partly because, generally speaking, the installments are shorter and a little more manageable, and also you do have a collaborator. You know that if you suggest the right imagery, if you can set up a situation where the words can play off the visuals right, then you're going to wind up with something that's more than just what you've put down on the page. And Gus is a perfect example of that. In Ego 7, which we're just finishing up now, it calls for a carnival on the planet Tortuga, where a lot of this takes place, and he just ran with it and came up with an entire mythology around the planet and who the gods being celebrated are, and things like that. And the result just utterly shines in the visuals. When you're writing prose, it's all you, and I find that exciting but intimidating. So I'm always a little less sure of myself when I do prose, but at the same time, I like the idea that I can go in and tweak it and make sure everything comes across exactly the way I want it to. So I don't know about switching back and forth. I don't really have a problem with that, but prose is trickier, partly for the reasons I mentioned, and also just because a novel has a lot of words in it. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff to put together. It's a lot to make sure fits. And I don't know. I love doing it, but it's a little harder.
So one thing I've noticed about Ego is just reading some of the interviews and stuff you've done about it. Was this influenced at all, at least in kind of theme from Watchmen, with the idea that a team is getting back who used to have these glorious days is getting back together to to fight an enemy? Well, it's not as politically deep
Yeah.
as Watchmen was. Anything is it influenced by that type of comic, or was it influenced from something completely different?
Um, that didn't occur to me consciously, but I'm sure it's in there. I mean, so many postmodern superhero groups owe a debt to Watchmen that I'm sure that was in the back of my head. There's a more obvious debt, I think, to the Legion of Superheroes, because it's about a team that started off as a team of teenagers in the future. And what I want to do is take that idea and make it a little more modern, a little more plausible, work a little more real science fiction into it. So that was a little more of a direct inspiration. But yeah, the Watchmen stuff. I mean, ever since Alan Moore wrote Miracle Man and Watchmen, anybody who writes superheroes with any kind of ambition at all to the job they're doing owes a debt to him. And I'm sure it was in the back of my head.
Was there any reasoning behind the lighter color palette? Because looking at comics I have nowadays, most of them are really heavy into the darker colors and contrast. While yours tends to be, at least the comic pages I've seen, is much lighter. It's much a softer, more more detailed touch.
That's all down to Gus. He colored the first 3 issues himself, and he's overseen the color since then. And he just has his style is a little bit, it's kind of European influenced more than most American comics are. And that's just the palette he likes to work with. It's the palette he chose. I think it's very distinctive. It's almost pastel in spots, which is not quite what you would expect, especially when the story gets kind of dark and violent, which it does sometimes. So that's I didn't choose that, but I'm very happy with it. I think it looks great.
Yeah, it definitely stands out as far as the art goes. Because pretty much everything I have from DC and Marvel nowadays is more heavy colored. Like you can not look like it's Photoshop, but you can definitely tell that they're looking for a specific look and specific colors and so much detail. While this one is definitely something different, which I like.
Well,
it stands out.
One of the great things about modern coloring is that you can do anything. Like you really can, and the colorist has so much control over what it looks like. I think sometimes coloring appears too dark in the mainstream comics for technical reasons. I think there are colorists who don't quite know how to make the distinction between how coloring appears on the monitor versus how it's going to look when it's printed. That does happen sometimes. But yeah, no. In our case, it was more a matter of just Gus's aesthetic than anything else.
Okay, so now we're going to switch just a bit to another comic you said you were working on recently, the Zodiac Legacy with that Stan Lee came up with and you're working on with him and artist Andy Tong.
That's right.
I have to say, the first time I saw this cover, I saw the word Convergence, and I was like, no, this is not DC.
Yes, I know. People have said that.
Way
That's
too
a
early.
complete coincidence. In fact, I was worried about them using the word convergence because it's such an important word in Thor: The Dark World. That's how far back we were working on this. But but no. First of all, it's not a comic. It's a novel. It's a middle reader's novel, heavily illustrated by Andy Tong. And that was pretty exciting to work on because Stan had come up with this. And Disney, by the time I came on, Disney had already engaged Andy to do some conceptual sketches and a few scenes, and then we kind of went back and forth. I worked on the novel. Stan contributed and gave feedback, and Andy was kind of drawing as we went, and then would make changes sometimes because I would change the story. The first volume's out now, and it seems to be getting a really nice response. So I'm just kind of finishing up volume 2 now, and there are going to be 3 in all.
So how much involvement does Stan Lee have in this? When Stan Lee's name is on this, what does this mean?
Well, it all came from him. It all came from his company. It goes through Disney, and he contributes things here and there. I would say I do more of the writing than he does, but he's given feedback at a lot of different stages, and he is he's amazing. He really is. Like, his comments are always dead on. The Zodiac legacy at base is a superhero team, and so much of it's like what you were asking about Watchmen before. Whenever you do a superhero team, especially one with some with young members in it, you just owe a lot to Stan. We did a group promotional phone call last week, and someone asked whether there were a lot of Stan Lee in-jokes, or someone asked how much of it was Stan and how much of it was me. And I said I couldn't tell at this point because I'm so, like, when I sit down to write something like this, I'm so inspired by what he and his collaborators did in the 1960s anyway, that it's kind of hard to tell where one starts and the other ends. So he's no, it's all from him, but it's a back and forth process.
And so this is done under Disney's banner and not Marvel or any other.
Yeah,
right? It's Disney itself.
Disney Publishing Worldwide. Yeah.
I have to say, I really like the art in this one. The black and white, but not black and white.
Yeah, it's 2 color. They decided to do that basically that was an artistic decision as much as anything. Excuse me. I think they started getting into Andy's art, and it just really lent itself to that. I love what he's doing. I think it's amazing. It's kind of a mix of, like, it's manga styled, but it's a little different than that. Like, Andy's worked on American comics and various kinds of illustration too. So he's good at he has this sort of mixed style that really works for this project.
Okay, and if I get the story of this one right, it's basically 12 magical superpowers based off of the Zodiac are unleashed on the world, and then there's a teenager named Steven who has to master these powers and save the world basically by unlocking all the powers of the Zodiac. So it's kind of like all the cartoons in my childhood.
A little bit. It's
Jackie Chan Adventures.
Steven is one of the Zodiac operatives. He's the tiger, and yeah, there are basically there are actually 13 characters running around because the dragon power is shared between one of the heroes and one of the villains. But basically there are there are all these powers running around, and some of them belong to the heroes and some of them belong to the villains. And the first volume is we spend a little time getting to know each of the heroes while they're getting used to their powers. Part of the book, the first half of the book is it's almost like a classic hero team origin story where we get to know them one at a time, and then it all turns into a big sort of battle and conflict with the villains. And hopefully it's all as tightly focused as we could manage on Steven and his journey, because when we open, he's a Chinese American kid. He's 14 years old, and he's never really thought much about his heritage. It's never been very important to him. But over the course of the story, he comes to see that where you come from is important, and it really shapes who you are. And that's a lot of what we're trying to do with this book.
Okay, and this looks like a rather thick book. It's like 400 pages,
yeah.
And it's aimed at which age group?
It's middle readers. I'm a little hazy on what exactly that means, but I think it's about 9 to 12, maybe a little.
9 to 12. Okay, So it's like the Percy Jackson range.
I think so. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I could still enjoy it
You could
and
still
not
enjoy
feel
it,
like
and I was urged over and over again by Disney as we were doing it not to write it down, not to even go. I mean, there's no gore in it or explicit sex, but we didn't shy away. It is a superhero story, so we wanted it to have real fights and some real action going on all through it. I think all that's there.
So it's the level of stories like we remember like seeing in like the Teen Titans series or Young Justice and those type of ones where they're aimed at kids, but at the same time you can
Yeah,
it's written, it's not written down.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Awesome. And you said the reception has been pretty good on this one so far. That's awesome. This actually looks. I'm probably I'm gonna go to Amazon right now and pre-order it, but I'll have to wait till we're done. So what brought you on into this project? Who invited you to work on Zodiac? Was it Stanley himself who invited you, or did Disney say we know this guy? Or
It came through Disney. There's an editor there named Nachi Marsham who I know who used to work at DC, and I know him not so much from when I was an editor there, but when I'd done a bunch of writing there before. And he thought of me, and he knew I'd recently done various other projects that were, like I said, superheroes in prose. I wrote the Civil War adaptation for Marvel. I coordinate their novels program now. And I had also done, there were a few other things too. I did a couple of Valiant stories for the launch of Kindle Worlds when they were commissioning stories from professional writers to kind of kick off that program. So I did an Exo Man-O-War and a Shadow Man story. So I had just come off of that stuff. So it's a weird discipline writing superheroes without pictures, or in this case, with pictures added later, because there are cases where an illustration really is worth 1,000 words, where it takes me the better part of a page to do what a good artist could show in one large panel. And there are other things too. Like in prose, you're a little more constricted about point of view. You don't want to be hopping around in and out of people's heads quite as much. Where in comics or film, you can kind of pan the camera around and shift much, much faster. So there are tricks, and I'd been doing a lot of that, and what I'd done had been pretty well received. So when they were starting up a project that was intended to be a modern take on superheroes in prose form, they thought of me for it. And Stan seems very happy with it. He keeps saying very, very nice things about me, which is embarrassing, but there you go.
so that's one last question about this one. Is the art looks very familiar. Did Andy Tong do the Tron comics by chance?
I don't know.
The prequel to Tron Legacy?
I don't know if he did Tron. I know he's done some things at Marvel, maybe about 10 years ago. I'd have to look that up. I'm not sure.
I'll try looking it up because he looks very familiar, and that's what it's reminding me of. So it probably is true. But you mentioned writing prose, and you just mentioned Marvel Civil War, which is definitely a book which made a splash.
Yes.
As you had to tackle summarizing close to 100 issues of a comic book event. So I guess the first question I want to ask is, how did they approach you to write Marvel Civil War, and what was your first thought when you realized what that job was?
Well, what they approached me with was that they wanted to start a line of novels, and Civil War was going to be the first one. And they wanted me to oversee the whole thing, but they knew they knew I'm more of a writer these days and that I'd like to write one. And I rather foolishly volunteered to do Civil War, partly because I knew we'd need to get someone up to speed pretty quickly, and I knew the series. I really liked the series, and I had ideas about how it could be done. So I just kind of charged into it while we were lining up people to do the subsequent novels. As far as the length of the project, I tried not to get bogged down in the crossovers, because Civil War itself is a fairly coherent, I think it's a 7-issue series. There's a lot of stuff that feeds into it, but the only really essential stories in terms of the through line narrative are some of the issues of Spider-Man that J. Michael Straczynski wrote, and maybe 1 or 2 FFs. The rest of it is all kind of on the side. It's very neatly woven in, but it turns out you can pull it all out without harming the story much at all. So I tried to concentrate on the core story, the core conflict between Iron Man and Captain America. The and with Spider-Man caught heavily in the middle because he's the pivotal character in the center of the whole thing. The trickiest part of it was uh, when they did, as you noted, when they did the event at Marvel, it was a line-wide event. It virtually every book tied into it in one way or another. Um, in writing a novel, I wanted it a little more self-contained, and I didn't want to be throwing in new Marvel like incidental Marvel characters in every corner. Partly because I wanted it to be accessible to people who weren't necessarily giant fans of the Marvel universe already. Um, so the trick is you don't want too many characters taking away from the core conflict, which is between Iron Man and Captain America. But you need a certain number of characters in there, or else it's not a war. It's just a fight between Captain America and Iron Man. So that was sort of the balance. I wound up doing a few more things. I There's a battle in the climax between, well, without giving too much away, between Thor or someone they think is Thor and Hercules, and I brought that down to Thor versus Spider-Man because I just thought it was better to have him more pivotal and central in the story. So I took liberties like that, but in general, it was a it was a tough challenge in a lot of ways because when the miniseries was so sprawling. It took in so much of the Marvel universe that a lot of the scenes were about 2 pages long. And when you write novels, you have to really expand that out, and you want to give more room. You want to give the core characters a lot more time. There wound up being exactly one scene in the entire book that was paced out pretty much the way it was in the comics, and that's the scene where Captain America turns against Shield, which is at the end of the first issue of the original miniseries. But everything else had to be pulled out. Also, I wanted to contain the narrative. I also wanted a woman, a female character, to be a little more important. And the character that jumped out at me and I wound up using was Susan Richards, the Invisible Woman, who's kind of important in the story, but it's not obvious if you read it quickly. So I just pulled her out and made her a little more central. It was an interesting exercise, and I'm pretty happy with it. I'm not always happy with my work when I'm done with it, but I think I would call this a case where the basic story, as controversial as it was, I thought was really solid and really interesting, and I thought the main conflicts not only made sense but had enough real world resonance that they were a lot of fun to work with, and at the same time there was plenty of room for me to expand on some of the core characters' motivations and conflicts while trimming out some of the stuff that wasn't necessary for a novel, if that makes sense. That was a very long answer.
That's a really good answer. So when you were trying to summarize all this, you have a lot of different comic creators, a lot of different writers, a lot of different politics put into there. Did you have a hard time weeding through some of the politics to see, some of it is more overt than others, depending on the writer, but did you have a hard time weeding through some of the politics to see which ones would actually work in a novel written, now versus, 2005,
Yeah,
4 when
2005,
Civil War happened?
2006. Yeah. Well, that's almost two different questions. The first thing is the difference between 2005 and when I wrote this book, which I think was 2012. And yes, there's a big difference. Civil War was one of the biggest events in comic book history, and the reason for it was Marvel. I think Dan Buckley from Marvel has called it lightning in a bottle, where they just hit this particular thing going on in the late Bush era, where everything seemed to be closing in, and the big question was, do we want to? How much of a security state do we want to live in? How many freedoms do we want to give up in order to be safe or perceive ourselves as safe from terrorists? And Civil War dealt with that in a lot of different ways. By the time I was writing the novel, we had a different president beginning his second term, and the climate of the country was different. And the way I approached it at that point was, well, we built this security state. We did. We made that decision after 9/11. Did you really think they weren't going to use it? So that was how I approached the politics from that standpoint. In terms of balance, I tried to be very careful about that. And the one big note I got from Tom Brevoort who was the original editor of the books, was um, do not uh, do not slant it too much in favor of Captain America, which I think he was having trouble with writers doing, because Captain America is he's the voice of, in a way, his stance within the book is not what you'd expect of him, because the big twist at the beginning of the first part is that he turns on Shield, he turns against the U.S. government, because what Cap is loyal to is the American dream, not any particular people in authority. And I thought that was great. And I did tend to sympathize with him a little more. But the thing about it is, as you really get into the story, Cap is kind of unreflective in this story. He doesn't question his actions as much as he should. He's very straightforward. Once he's sort of made a decision and sticks with it regardless of what's going on, and that leads to the rather unexpected ending. Whereas Tony Stark, I found just a fascinating character all the way through. I loved writing him. Because he was criticized a lot as a character within this story for being a bit of a fascist, for trying to register the superheroes, for not considering what the ramifications of this were. But in fact, he questions himself at every stage, and that's there in the original. But I was able to spin that out a lot more, and he just struck me as the kind of character who he's the way his mind is always working. It's always spinning around. It's always he's always considering the ramifications. He's always considering different sides of an issue. So while he's pretty much set his mind as well throughout this whole thing, he pays a price for it at every stage. Like he has doubts. He just knows this is the right thing to do, and whether it is or not is kind of left to the reader to decide in the end.
That's the beauty of it. And now we get to see Civil War, at least the Marvel Cinematic Universe version on the big screen.
I'm really looking forward to that.
So, from someone who's had to adapt it to a novel, how hard do you think it's going to be for those writers? Well, I guess you've already written it, but to adapt that to the big screen with the resources and characters which they have already established?
Well, those guys, I've worked with them a little bit. I co-wrote two of the art of the movie books with them, Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World. And those guys are geniuses. They really, when they pulled off Thor, it's not even my favorite of their movies, but when they pulled off Thor without screwing up the character or radically changing it, I thought, these guys can do anything. But they have an entire context set up now for their universe that's a bit different from what Marvel was doing in 2005. So I'm sure it'll be, because it's a Cap movie, I'm sure it'll be slanted a little more toward him, one way or another. The extent of Robert Downey Jr.'s involvement in the movie has been rumored one way and another. I don't know quite how that's been resolved. And actually that's another interesting point. I was writing the novel, post Iron Man movies. The Iron Man movies hadn't come out yet when Mark Miller and Steve McNiven did the original Civil War series. So it was fun to kind of take their version of Iron Man and slant it a little more toward the smart-ass version that Robert Downey Jr. and I'm blanking on his name, the director of the first two movies. Created.
Favreau.
Jon Favreau, yes, of course. That they created. So that was kind of fun. But yeah, they'll do. I think they're going to do something great. I'm sure it'll be different. I'm sure it'll be different from what I did or from what Mark Miller did. But they know what they're doing.
So this is just pure speculation. If you actually know something, just say no, and I'll just cut it out. But
I probably don't.
Without spoiling the end of Civil War, even though most of us know what happens, how pivotal do you think that moment at the end of Civil War with a certain major character is to the actual arc? Do you think that Marvel's going to have to go that way with their story, or at least something like it?
I think that depends on. I don't know, and I think that depends on their future plans more than anything else. That moment that you were talking about, if it's the one I'm thinking of, is not even in my novel, and I got some criticism for that because people remember that as the end of Civil War, but it's actually not. It happened right after. Civil War ends with one of the major characters being arrested. And in fact, there's a little scene at the very end of, there's a one-panel scene at the very end of the last issue of Civil War that shows him in jail. and I expanded that out into a short epilogue. But I didn't feel we're talking around something, and I'm almost tempted to spoil it because it's the entire title of a giant giant series that ran for 2 years.
And I guess most people know why Winter Soldier and Falcon exist.
Yeah, yeah. But I felt like showing the death of Captain America, and you can cut it out if you want. You can bleep it. I think it'd be one long bleep.
No, I'll just leave it there. Most people know it's there.
Yeah, but I felt like showing that at the end of Civil War was thematically wrong. It did not the events of Civil War paved the way for that in the comics, but it's really not the way the series ends. And the story is not about one of the characters dying. It's about one of the characters giving up and surrendering and being defeated. And that just fit the story I was writing much more. We did do a Death of Captain America novel adaptation written by Larry Hama that just came out this past fall. That's quite good too.
Well, I can definitely say Marvel Kevin Feige, since he's the one pulling the strings, he has his work cut out for him to make that work. But now that they got a certain web slinger on their side, it'll make that story a lot easier to tell.
That should be very interesting. Yeah, yeah. That's great news.
Imagine being a writer for that movie before they got that permission.
Imagine being the writer on deadline when that came through. That'd be some late nights, I'm sure.
Okay, so now we have some time to just go over some of the rest of your projects as we wrap this up. I know some listeners always want to ask DC versus Marvel, but what appealed to you as a child to read into DC, and then what drew you over to Marvel in the long run?
Well, like I said, when I think partly this is a really superficial answer, but I think when I was really little, I liked the fact that there were more pages in the DC comics. I just felt like I was getting a little ripped off by Marvel. But once I got a little more discerning, like I said, the Marvel stuff, I read Spider-Man when I was young, but aside from that, I really hadn't read very much of their stuff, and their stuff seemed a little more like a club, which I think is what is the good and bad of what Stan created there. Like on the one hand, if you read the stuff for a while, you felt like you belonged, like you were part of the Merry Marvel Marching Society, whatever you called it. But at the same time, I didn't, like, it felt like a little too much of an investment for me. But again, when I was a teenager, I got into it, and the whole thing seemed just much more sophisticated, and much more exciting too. It seemed like a place where the heroes were more human, where the creators took more chances. I could sense individual voices coming out a little more. And then as we got into the 80s, a lot of that started to happen at DC. DC, well, a lot of the big writers from Marvel went to DC at least for short stints. But DC started to take a lot more chances when they started experimenting with more different formats. They started doing more books for adults, starting big way with the Alan Moore Swamp Thing, which you mentioned, which led to Vertigo and a lot of the stuff I worked on there in the 90s. But I don't know, like to me, they both have their appeal, and they've been very different at different times. I think to me, DC always feels like the homey stuff, the stuff that really touches me in the heart, and Marvel seems like the really exciting stuff. It seems like the more dangerous stuff, the stuff that ultimately gets my blood racing a little more.
I can agree with that one. I think for me it would be DC. When you have DC can strike gold with certain books, like for example, Batman Hush, and that book is amazing. But then of course you read the sequel and it's garbage. With DC, when they have a great book, it's great. Marvel tends to be consistent throughout, so rather than having an all-around, great book right there, they have a consistent series that you know what to expect. While DC tends to be, it's either really great or sometimes it's too long or it's garbage.
That's interesting. Yeah. I haven't looked at it quite that way. I tend to think it changes a lot over time too. Like, I mean, DC now is not, it's not the DC it was even 5 or 10 years ago, because they've had such a big change in management, and now they're actually moving physically to Burbank. So I think things are going to change. And just recently, I think DC's opened up quite a lot. They seem to be much more open to individual voices and new ideas, particularly after books like the new Batgirl have hit. So that's cool. That's really nice. But I think Marvel's also had a really good run the last few years, and I think they've done a nice job of encouraging some of their top writers. I love most of Mark Waid's work there. He's been doing some great stuff. So I think Marvel's been a pretty friendly shop to creators over the last 5 to 10 years.
And DC also seems to be more fractured because you have the DC animated world with Bruce Timm and all those people doing amazing stuff.
Yeah.
You have their movies with WB, not quite sure what they're doing half the time. And then you have the comics, and they don't seem to be meshing very much. So I think Geoff Johns is working hard to have the comics mesh more with the movie, well, not the movie, the TV universe, which he has been helping with. So hopefully that the feel is going to be more meshed together, which Marvel has done really well of. A Marvel book, a Marvel movie, Marvel show would feel the same.
Well, part of that goes back to the fact that, and I think this speaks to the strength of the Marvel characters as they were created by Stan and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and the other people who were involved. But if you look at the Marvel characters over the years, like the real core ones, most of them have not changed very much. Where DC has been all about change. DC has had a generational approach to its characters for a long time. So in a way, Marvel's characters are easier to keep in line because most versions of them are very similar, even though the tone might be a little different or the art style could be different, that sort of thing. With DC, there's a lot more variety, but it's also a little chaotic. Like it's a little hard to keep straight. But you also brought up something else interesting, which is Marvel so far has really ruled the roost in terms of movies. But DC's made incredible leaps on TV, and they've got what do they have, like 6 television shows on this year, something like that. It's
yeah, like 6, and then they have like Booster Gold, Krypton, a few more coming out, and not to mention their animated ones.
Yeah, and both companies are trying to, like DC's announced a very ambitious film slate, and Marvel's moving a little more slowly with TV, but they've gotten a really good reception to Agent Carter, so they're moving along that way. But it's almost like they each worked better in one of them worked better in films and one of them worked better in TV so far.
Okay. So I guess I'll do 2 more questions. This one is just about general writing. Since we have a lot of writers who like to listen and they like getting advice, what do you do for writing inspiration when you're stuck writing either a comic or a book? How do you get yourself out of writer's block? What do you do for inspiration to get yourself in the mood to write and just get it done?
I do most of my heavy writing in the mornings. I'm a day person, and I get up. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I tend to get up and I like to take long walks. And whenever I'm stuck, I just sort of stop. I tend to get up, walk somewhere, do a little work in a coffee shop, and if I get stuck, I take another walk. And there's something about walking around New York City where there's just constant input. You just hear the strangest things. You're constantly passing people. There's all kinds of architecture. It's just really kind of inspiring to me. So that's my main technique. But I do most of my serious writing in the mornings, and then when I can more safely caffeine myself up too. And then in the afternoons, I tend to do polishing and revisions and cleanup work and editorial work if I'm doing any of that. So I regiment my day that way. Everyone's different, of course. I know writers who can only write at night, where I'd rather goof off. I'd rather hang out with my wife at night. But in terms of writer's block, yeah, sometimes things just don't come to you, but I tend to be working on enough projects at once that if something's really not working for me, I'll just switch to another one for a while and let the first problem percolate in the back of my mind. And that usually works. That usually comes together.
Okay, so right in the morning for you, find a way to relax and then work on other projects. I know some people try to focus on one at a time, but I guess with lots of different projects at one time, you can afford to shift.
It's tricky. I prefer not to get interrupted too much when I can't work on too many things at once. But if something's really not coming together, sometimes it does help to leave it for a few days and work on something else.
Okay, and then the last question which we'll ask we'll probably ask for a bumper at the end. Last question which we'll ask is, well, you can have the soapbox. You can promote anything else you have yet to promote, anything you want to say to the fans, to listeners, You can promote your website, promote comic appearances, whatever you'd like to promote that hasn't been said or you want to reiterate. Here's your chance to promote your stuff again.
Okay. Well, the main thing I really want to promote is Egos, because that's my baby, and it's coming out now. Issue 5 is out now. Issue 6 will be out March 2nd. I'll be at Emerald City Con. I'll have a table there, and I'll be selling copies of the trade paperback as well as the new issues. So please stop by and see me there if I'm there. You can also find me on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Stuart Moore 1 on both of them. So I guess that's it. I appreciate being here and you having me, and I hope this winter ends soon. That's my other wish. That's my farewell wish for this interview.
I hope it does too. I'm in Utah, and we, like 2 weeks ago, it was like 65, 70 degrees, which is really weird because it's supposed to be winter 4,000 feet up.
Yeah.
And then it's 20 again today, and it just won't make up its mind. Is it a coat weather, or you'll go out and it's 60, then you'll come home an hour later and it's 20?
Yeah, well, 20 is a warm day around here lately. Although it's getting a little better. It's getting a little better now.
Yeah, but when you go out with short sleeves and shorts, 20 gets really cold.
Yeah. I imagine.
So the last thing I'd just like to ask, if it's possible, would you be willing to record a bumper just saying something along the lines of, "This is Stuart Moore, author of whatever projects you want to insert in here, and you're listening to Bombad Radio"?
And you're listening to Bombad Radio. Got it.
Yep.
Right now?
Yep, ready to go.
Okay. This is Stuart Moore, author of Egos and the Zodiac Legacy, and you're listening to Bombad Radio.